ships of state may make no sense to nations who don't know the term. Nations like Great Britain, the US, Germany, Netherlands, and a few others know the term, and for them it is a short way of saying the whole collective enterprise in which we as a nation are involved and which is public and which we call a state. And the ship of state is usually sort of a short reference to that, and it's usually used in times of crises. I just say this ahead of time because some of you may be from countries where this notion is not at all common. What I need now is for the images to be, that you cut the light out. You're fine, it's totally dark, that's great. Yeah, okay, that's also good. But you can see, you can later on try to make it totally dark and see whether it's better. Let me start, since this is a Max Weber lecture, let me start with a quote by Max Weber. And Max Weber says, "It is no accident that the rudder of the Reich was in the hands of one of the mighty landowners for nearly a generation. All the glorious qualities that the inherited art of rule over land and people can produce come together in this character as well as the dark shadows." When Weber here talks about this person, he talks about Bismarck. And when he talks about the rudder of the Reich, he is talking about the ship of state, rudder, Reich, in an abbreviated form. That's from his Australian studies in 1892. I will later go a little more into this, but not into very great detail. Today, we are going to take a pictorial look at the history of an abstract concept, that of statehood. It's a history that reveals the very real power of metaphor, not just as an adornment in speech and literature, but as an active force in the development of nations and their institutions. We'll start out with a brief look at the surprisingly ancient origins and etymology of the metaphor ship of state, and how it was later conflated with the jurisdictions of the Christian Church. We'll skip forward to the 16th century when state and church began to pull apart. And then I'll talk briefly about the various ways the metaphor was used in the development of the modern state, noting the differences between revolutionary and evolutionary origins and between unitary and federal systems. We take a pictorial journey through examples in 3 cases. Germany from unification and reunification to present, Europe from the first dreams of integration to present, and if we have time and you're interested, and probably we won't have time, the US from the revolution to present. But if you're really interested, then I prepared for the paper, including the images. Let's start with the etymology. The etymological origins of the ship of state metaphor are twofold and can be found in the etymology of modern European words for government and state. This is sort of a 2-level thing. The word government in English, for example, derives from Greek and Latin words for a ship's rudder, or the verb for steering a ship. Kybernaion, gubernare, gubernator, government, governor. Still today, the rudder of a ship, of a sailboat and stuff is called gubernator. So the usage is old and spans 2,500 years, and it is parallel. It starts from the boat and moves to the polis, and then in this parallel swing it goes all the way to today. So that's sort of one side of the etymology. The other side is the use of the word of state in the sense of government derives from the Latin verb stare, which also came to mean, which then came to mean standing army, standing government, and its participle status, which works its way into expressions such as State of the Union and Status Rei Publicae. This usage is new, the usage as state, in the sense that we talk about it, and dates to the status turn in the 16th century. So you have this state, meaning more than status, as something which is superimposed on another meaning, government, gubernare, which is 2,500 years old, and which is sort of the ship's, has the ship in the background. From an etymological perspective, the ship of state thus combines the dynamic in the sense of steering or guiding a populace, and static in the sense of a stable condition. So the ship is the dynamic part, and the state, the starter, is the static part. The standing army, the standing bureaucracy, etc. The ship of state in antiquity. The first evidence of the actual use of the metaphor as such dates back to the ancient Greeks. At least 2,500 years. You find it first mentioned with Aristophanes' Ship of Polis in the Wasps. He talks about this. There's earlier mentions which are somewhat dubious whether they really mean this, but this is the first place where it's clear it's meant. And you also find it like in Plato's ship's parable, where he talks about the polis as a ship and how one elects captains, and where he votes sort of for the most able captain and not for the captain with the most votes. And then we find it again, which is my first interesting point to make. And maybe if you switch the light now fully off, let's see whether it makes any difference. I think you see more. So the first, we find it again in the evolution of Roman law and the notion of an independent legal entity, of state, res publica as an independent legal entity. According to Greek mythology, the ship that Theseus, the uniting king of Athens, used on returning to Athens from Crete, also he went to Crete on that ship, after defeating the Minotaur and freeing Athenian youths from a Cretan vendetta, you might call that, was kept in the Athenian marketplace as a memorial for several centuries. Now this is the Ship of Theseus from a painting of the early 16th century. There is no, we know the Greek story about this, but from Greek times there is several depictions of that ship, but going to Crete and coming back, not on the marketplace, where it was for several hundred years. And this painting sort of tells you the whole story of Theseus and the Minotaur. Now the ship was periodically refurbished by the Athenians, who replaced the rotting old planks with newer and stronger ones. It raised a paradox for generations of philosophers. If all the parts of the ship were replaced, was it still the same ship? For the Roman lawyer P. Alfenus Varus in 30 BC, the ship represented not a paradoxical dichotomy of same versus different, but rather degrees of sameness. How can the boat of Theseus still be the boat of Theseus when the parts are renewed over and over again? This, for him, was the key to constructing the concept of a legal entity, or of a, as the Germans would say, a juridical person, that bears responsibilities independent of the ever-changing persons that constituted it. So, with this parable, or this paradox in mind, he reasoned that the ship of Theseus is sort of, in analogy, something which we should think of as a republic, and the citizens are sort of the planks which die and have to be replaced by new citizens who are born anew or who are made members. And therefore the state exists independent of its members and is an eternal person that has its own rights, can be sued, can take its own actions. So it's already a different concept than that of the polis. So you see that from the early times, there is not only the idea of a ship of state, but there is also the idea of a state becoming independent, being tied to a ship of state of Athens as the parable for Roman law. Now that the independence of the state in the sense that we then see maturing in the 17th, 18th century is quite different from what we saw then is another issue. But the tradition of thinking about the state as a ship and the tradition of reasoning about the independence of the state with the ship as an example is already in place. Now we get disturbed a little by what I call the next 1300 years. From the early 4th century, when Constantine the Great converted to Christianity, to the 17th century, concepts of church and governance were conflated in Western culture. This is apparent in the double meaning of the ship metaphors of the period, which came to symbolize both religious and worldly or temporal reigns at the same time. The ship as a metaphor for the spiritual and social makeup of the church appeared not just in artworks and literature, but also in the actual construction of places of worship, and was used also by the church itself to describe the Christian faith as such. So the Pope in Rome, when he wanted to appeal to all of Christendom, he talked about the church as being a ship for all the faithful. And if you look into the vocabulary, you talk about a Kirchenschiff, when you talk about the main body of a real building of a church, and in English you talk about a nave, directly from navis. So you have the ship of church on the one hand, and you have the ship of state, or the ship representing the worldly or the temporal aspects of governance that were sort of separate before Constantine, confluing after Constantine and becoming sort of one. So there's a metaphor with two, it becomes one metaphor with two, that looks in two directions, sort of Janus-headed or double-headed or whatever you want to say. And until the 17th century, the ship as an icon was usually a two-faced image reflecting both the spiritual and the temporal authority. Now the turning point for all of this is the 17th century. I call this sort of the statist turn. When we talk about this turn, we talk about the emergence of the modern meaning of state. And now in these passages I heavily rely on Skinner, Quentin Skinner, and the foundations of modern political thought. And he says, when we talk about the emergence of the modern meaning of state, then we talk about it as a public power separate from the ruler and the ruled, and constituting the supreme political authority within a certain defined territory. So you see the notion of independence is in there again. Independent of persons, not just citizens, but also rulers. And also we talk about the more abstract idea that there is an independent political apparatus, that of the state, which the ruler may be said to have a duty to maintain. So the idea of the state not just being a mantle of a ruler, but an apparatus. Now he says this was established first in places that had a relatively unified central authority, that had an increased apparatus of bureaucratic control, and that had a clearly defined set of natural boundaries. Now when do we see this in place? Skinner points to France, England, and Spain as the countries where the first conceptual breakthrough occurred. In France, for example, it started in the 1520s, and according to Skinner, culminated in Jean Baudin's The Six Books of the Commonweal in 1756. And in England, it started around the end of the Cromwellian regime in the 1530s, when the necessary set of material as well as intellectual preconditions had been achieved. He dates the Spanish turn to statism in the same period. So what we see in these times then is also a decoupling of spiritual and temporal authority. What had been coupled in the 4th century onwards is now decoupled. After the Reformation and the 30 Years' War, it became abundantly apparent that religious and temporal authority would need to be separated. If the various new Christian factions were to coexist in one territory, the Ship of State likewise lost its double meaning. Through its religious history, though its religious history was still occasionally apparent or implied, the metaphor entered the 18th century on its own, largely secular in nature, and came to embody the unitary image of political sovereignty. So Ship of State is the sovereign state, the unified sovereign state, or the unified modern state, as we would now say. The Ship of State at that time also fits into a grand... I'm sorry, I have a cold, so I'm trying to fight it all the while. The Ship of State metaphor in these days, in the 18th century, is also being reinforced by a grand shift to the concept of the state as a machine. The emergence of the concept of the modern state generated new metaphors, and in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the state was often compared to a machine, producing reliable results in a standardized way. And that was usually sort of the underpinning of the absolute monarchy in its legitimacy. And you might say that sailing ship was well adapted to these new concepts, itself a man-made apparatus powered by the forces of nature, but guided by a cooperative hierarchy of men. Indeed, it may represent Hobbes' notion as well or better than his artificial man or Leviathan. Now, ships of state metaphors during the statist term, before I get to my countries, I want to show you how these things separate in the 17th century. With 3 images from the 17th century, when the frame of reference shifted and the modern state emerged, and serves as an example for the statist term. Now first look at the Dutch image. So we are now at this turning point part. At this Dutch image from 1620, it is, well, it is sort of the ship of state, the ship metaphor. On it you find Moritz of Orange, on it you find the head of the Calvinist church, on it you find the 7 provinces of the Netherlands. From the tops shines the state Bible, which had been revised at the Synod of Dort, held by an angel and shining through all the world, and onlooking are the Turks and the blacks at the New Jerusalem of the North. And in the waters are the Catholics. So what you see here is religion, statehood, and ship are sort of fused into one. It's sort of the generals, Moritz of Orange, the religious people are there. And it is also interesting to see who is not depicted. The enemy faction at the Synod of Dort, where people who believed you could do something for your own savior, so being saved, coming to the heavens. In your own lifetime, not everything was predestined. And the people who were fighting for it were the people from the trade cities in the west, the port cities, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, etc. The people who headed it. Doesn't work? Yes. The people who headed it was Van den Barneveld. He was beheaded by these people. His left hand, you probably know by name, Hugo Grotius. So one of the founders of international public law. He was put in jail lifelong, but he escaped in a book case. But it shows you that sort of it shows you that the counter-Catholic Calvinist state construction in the first revolutionary state of the Netherlands was a very religious thing and is still very close to what I would call the 4th and 5th century fusion construction of ship of state and ship of church. Now if we go on a little, not there, I come back, we come to the execution of Charles I in 1649, and there are several depictions of this who are similar. And you see here, the captain is being thrown overboard from the ship of state. So that's one thing that happens. The other thing that happens is the chapel of Parliament is being hit by lightning. And this is sort of happening for the reason that that is happening. So you have the ship of state already somewhat graphically distanced, and from graphically distanced. Church now. The Catholic Church has been thrown out by the Calvinists. The Calvinists are here in the water attacking it. This is Calvin shooting at the ship of church. There is nothing in the adornments or in the personnel of the ship. Those are the apostles and the popes and God knows who. But there is no Moritz of Orange, there is no Habsburg or whatever. So you have a pure ship of church again, as you are getting pure ships of state. So these things are going apart in this period. Okay, that's sort of the status turn. Now, before I go into further images, ships of state and the development of modern states, different trajectories in different types of states. I give you sort of a short overview and then go into these 2 or 3 cases, probably more likely to Germany and Europe, European integration. As to the modern ship of state, I need to alert you to some distinctions in the nature of states as they reflect on the ship of state. Revolutionary state creations versus non-revolutionary state creations, or evolutions, non-revolutionary evolutions. The ship of state, in one way or another, seems to play a role in all European and North American countries. At least I thought so until now. I don't know enough about Portugal and Spain, but I assume they share the same Greco-Roman traditions. And since they were neighbor countries, I also assumed that it would matter to them. Somehow it is especially prominent in bottom-up revolutionary state creations, like the Netherlands and the US. In both of these countries, as you saw from the Dutch images from 1620, and as you could see when you look at the US images, in both of these countries, these things were there from the start. But they are also relevant in more top-down, let's say, white revolution state creations like Germany, and I will show you the German case in more detail later. Italy being the exception, there you don't really find much of this sort. You might find some equivalents to the Ship of State that I haven't yet really discovered in my travels. In countries like France and England, which slowly evolved on a much wider time horizon, the Ship of State religiously adorned accompanied the process, and at certain junctures, like the Cromwellian or the French Revolution, showed their prominence, though in England more than in France. The next issue, revolution versus evolution, is unity versus multitude. The origin of the image per se would seem to relate better to unified, homogeneous units like the Roman Catholic Church, or to non-federal nation states, i.e. to unitary constellations, since the ship is sort of a monolithic construction. And as the meaning shrank to temporal, to worldly reign, it would seem to shrink to protecting the one, the unitary sovereignty, so it would seem that unitary states like Great Britain are the best fit. One would therefore think that federal, i.e. non-unitary states don't quite fit the image, but actually the image has flourished particularly well there in the federal countries and has been especially long-lasting in such countries. See the USA, see Germany, see the EU, a federation of sorts. Maybe this is so because the challenge of unity in multi-tiered governmental constructions is permanent and unavoidable, quite different from unitary constellations, and therefore the appeal to unity that is in the image is used very often, is referred to very often. Okay, just one last point about the different reference frames to unity. It most often is used in times where unity needs to be achieved or is in great doubt in crises. It is also then often used when unity is taken as a self-understood premise and it just becomes sort of a matter of technique of using it, and then it is often used in a meaningless way, and I can show you examples for both from like meaningless, meaning that the notion becomes sort of more like a joke than an appeal to a serious a crisis or to a serious political challenge. Now, I have some thousand of these images in Bremen for 20 or so countries, and I've chosen to focus on the federal side of the Ship of State by contrasting a more top-down revolution, Bismarck's Germany, with a more bottom-up one, the US, which gives me a chance at the EUI to add another recent example of multi-tiered politics, the European Federation images. It seems proper to dwell on these at the EUI, so I took this route. The alternative would have been to take a chronological approach across all countries concerned, where France and England would have taken the lead, and maybe Spain and Portugal if I knew more about them. I will start with the cases geographically closest to Florence, Germany and Europe, and will then proceed to the US if time still allows. And starting with Germany may also not be the worst approach for a Max Weber lecture. First, Germany. The latecomer to the political image. It came to the political image only in the 1890s. As you saw from the earlier pictures, the Dutch had it already in the 17th century. Germany, Prussia has no political tradition with this ship image, except to its classical education, through its classical education. I mean, they knew about the wasps, Stephanus, they read Horace, the poem on the ship. They knew Plato, etc. We have the case of the timely invention of an image by borrowing it from the UK in 1890. I'll go into the details soon. Prussia, since Frederick the Great, was oriented towards the continent, the landmass, not the sea. In his testament, Frederick the Great had forbidden, or had basically forbidden any of his followers to make the sea their main domain. The country is your domain. Prussia is a continental nation. So the ship image did not fit easily, and the eagle and the sword fitted much better. The sea was to be left to England and its navy. Wilhelm II broke with that in building his own navy in the mid-80s. Now the image fits. But you get a very peculiar German persistent background image for the ship of state, the private yacht of the Kaiser, of Kaiser Wilhelm II. And you will find a period where the image seems to have gone out of use, the Nazi period. Why, I don't know. I've used a Max Weber epitaph from 1892 where he indirectly refers to Bismarck as the captain of the ship of state. Max Weber uses the metaphor precautiously before the naval armament politics of Wilhelm II, but he applies it to the main actor of the ship, Bismarck. Weber was more familiar with the classical background of the ship of state metaphor, and he himself normally relied on another background metaphor that also dates to the 17th and mostly to the 18th century, the state as a machine. And it isn't the same ship, not to speak of the steamship, the Kaisersjacht. Isn't that just one version of such a machine? If, like Weber, you understand the modern state as a factory, the view of the state as a machine seems appropriate, and the ship would seem to be much like a factory, according to Weber, a good place to study how, according to the requirements of the work process, labor can take on a new rhythm corresponding with the planned dissection of the functions of individual muscles and the forcing of an optimal use of energies. Okay, I will now come to Germany. This is the first known use of the ship of state metaphor in Germany. This is German unification. Bismarck steers the German ship of state into safe waters. In the background, the French ship of state is sinking. This, by the way, is not a German source. It is an Austrian in a German-English magazine published out of St. Louis, which was the first satirical magazine ever published, and it has a long tradition in the US. And you find grand caricatures there in the US, quite independent of the ship of state. Now this is the caricature everybody knows, dropping the pilot. Wilhelm II throws Bismarck out in 1890. Some say Bismarck tried a coup d'etat and Wilhelm got rid of it. Now what's peculiar about this thing is that this is the yacht of the Kaiser. It is not some army ship, but it's a salon ship. This thing here, there were long speculations in Germany what this is, whether Bismarck is closing off a cannon sitting in there. But if you look at it closely, this is a larger window, as a salon ship should have it. And these are just the window closers or closets, I don't know, Fensterläden, I don't know how that is in English. And they open right here and they leave a little light in independently. So the idea that Bismarck is the one who holds the cannons back and now the Kaiser, the loose gun, is running the thing is probably pictorially wrong. But anyhow, this is basically every German school kid since 1890 knows this. And this thing has seen it and has learned it. And you will see it in the following cartoons. But I also wanted to show you that the ship of state is not just a matter of cartoons, it is also a matter, as you already saw, of oil paintings, it's also a matter of statues. Now there are two statues which I'm trying to contrast. This one is Wilhelm II's brother-in-law in Baden, who gets a present from the 8 large cities. And you see, on his 70th birthday, you see him standing up there in the back. Up here in the front is science with a torch, enlightening the future. Here is what is called Nährstand, agriculture, and here is a naked warrior. And here is Hercules, who tries to hold the whole thing in balance. So this is how in 1896 the Wilhelm II's brother-in-law is being feasted on such a jubilee, and this is how the German states feast Wilhelm II himself in 1913 by giving him a Viking ship of state, sort of being sort of the aggressive northern North Sea empire on wheels, or not on wheels but on boats. Up here is the eagle, here is the crown, and this was given by all the dukes in all the Hanse cities in 1930 to the Kaiser. It took the Kaiser till 1925 to get the final version of it, because the war, der Krieg kam dazwischen, quote unquote, say the sources, because the war somehow got in the way. But I think you can see by contrasting these two things what sort of a civil versus a militaristic version of a ship of state at that time meant to artists and to the ruling class. I lead you through the further material much more faster so we get ahead. Then you have how the Punch returned to this in a cartoon called The Haunted Ship, where Bismarck returns on board. The Kaiser has gotten old, and Bismarck says, "I wonder if he would drop me now." Bismarck is already dead, you're in the middle of the war. It's Bismarck's 100th birthday. I would have been had he not died. Here you have another pickup of the motive. The Kaiser is being led into oblivion with this, so there's no boat down there, so if he goes down, he will die. And up there is a troop from the Allies. And then you see the motive going through the Weimar Republic by the right-wing parties, 1920 elections, by the Social Democrats electing him for president, by Hindenburg, where the ship of state is sort of up there where the curtain is. From there he throws his life preserver or lifesaver into the German blonde who is being killed by the party system. So the Nazi period doesn't use the metaphor, or at least I didn't find any. Then you find it reappearing all the time through the Federal Republic. This is sort of the earliest one I found. This is sort of when Adenauer goes to Moscow, and Oldenhauer, the lifeboat, Adenauer sort of put him up there so he couldn't get out, and then he changed himself. And he wanted to get the German war prisoners out, but he didn't want to make any agreements about East and West German stuff with him. So that's what this whole, these are the Russians up there, trying to be nice from Silla. Then you have practically for every government, this being the Kiesinger one, caricatures of this sort. And then Brandt has to leave because of Guillaume, so he is depicted in a similar way to Bismarck. Schmidt is up there. Schmidt is ruining his ship of state. Genscher is fishing for the CDU in 1982. Schmidt is going down. Now you have it for a more critical case. This is one of the early illustrations of the East German situation where they're trying to push Honecker off board of the East German ship of state. Here you have another version of this. The East German ship of state. The caricature is called "The State Breaks Down, Rescue Not Wanted, Bleiben Sie wo Sie sind, Stay Where You Are." This thing here is supposed to be West Germany, and this East Germany, and the ship has run aground, it's high up. Here's another one. Lothar de Maizière, the last prime minister of the GDR. His ship is already sort of becoming a submarine, but it isn't a submarine. And one is sort of plowing him over. So you see that the ship of state metaphor is all over the place. It is here also from 1993, when through reunification and globalization, the big ship of the German state called the Fat Years is going down the drain. And this is not East Germany, this is sort of some other Verheißung, some other grand promise, but this certainly is the German, the Deutsche Michel. Then you have, again, sort of the 2+4 agreement in a foreign caricature from New Zealand. Here you have, again, a German one, where the US subprime crisis is being done in the Ship of State way, where Angela Merkel says to the crew, just don't panic, we stay on course. And then that's it for that part. Now I come to the EU. Again, a short introduction. The Ship of State image is still used a lot in Europe, but it also depends on the national lenses in national publics. Most depictions of the EU are captive to the national public spheres, and thus to different national traditions. Therefore, you are more likely to find such ship images in Germany than in France, etc. And probably if Spain doesn't have such a tradition, you don't find any there. Therefore, the image has a currency for the EU in those nations where it has an independent currency in the national political system. The peculiar issue today is the EU a state at all? What is it? But in the 50s and 60s, most people, without thinking much about it, took the EC as a federal union like the US, the United States of Europe. This phrase could still be found in the CDU's party program in the early 1990s. Therefore, the Ship of State was a natural, though retrospectively utopian fit. In the EU, you will again get a different peculiar image of Ship of State. An invented 1950 icon, that's what, that is what this is. An invented 1950 icon that reached the EU center from a small member state, the Netherlands, through the Marshall Plan, illustrates the unity issue well. It dates to 1950. It is actually a hidden copycat from the Dutch-English wars in the 18th century, the Battle of the Medway, the Dutch ship, the Seven Provinces. Had the jury been able to look behind the curtain in 1950, the Dutch image might not have won the contest because the English jurors would have liked a ship from the Battle of the Medway too. And the image is ambivalent enough to symbolize a federal union as it will, I show later, also its opposite. To some onlookers who only focus on the flags, you only see nation states. To those onlookers who focus on the ship image, you see Europe as a federal state. But let me go back one. This image I want to start with. This is why I said Europe starts in 1577. This is actually a funny. This is done by a member of the Privy Council who appeals to Elizabeth I to throw the Spanish and Portuguese out of Europe and to become the new hegemon in Europe, and that's important, to establish a common market there, just as they had just established it in Britain itself. So you see in this photo in several places appeals to the common market. If you look at the source, it's pretty analyzed very carefully in detail. You can see that. So the idea, Europe, a ship, a common market, but in a Protestant spirit. If you subtract the Protestant spirit, you have the European integration market idea there. If you add the Protestant spirit, you have a little something else there. We are still in the century, we are still pre the divorce of religion, the Ship of State. That's why it is still united. So this is actually the first real European integration ship. It comes 1 week after Monet reveals the European community of coal and steel intentions in the Quai d'Orsay, and is given in the Quai d'Orsay by the Marshall Plan authorities the first prize to this guy called Wayne Dirksen. What is this. This is Mercury, the god of trade. And note this, the Turkish flag. In the Marshall Plan, the Turks were part and parcel. This actually was picked up later by the EU, and this became then sort of one of the symbols that was in play in Brussels for a long time, still is in play. And you might, I mean, this was an inter-European cooperation for better living conditions. That was a competition about the price competition. Just imagine what the Germans handed in. They also got a price 15 or something. They handed in a big pot with goulash in it, and a cook who stirred it, and the 12 flags, or however many they are, the 15 flags, were on the goulash canona, on the pot. So, I mean, they interpreted living conditions very literally. The jury obviously didn't interpret it very literally, because they took this unification idea as federation idea. Let's make a new state out of Europe that avoids war, the main thing. And then this goes on, I go through it shortly. This is a cartoon from the 1981. De Gaulle tries to extend his projet social to Europe in Luxembourg. And Schmidt and Thatcher are trying to argue against it. Basically, it's about making social Europe, making Europe a domestic policy beyond the market. Then you have the policy of letting migrants come in or not in. The boat is full, and it is full, ironically. Then you have another version that you well know here of this thing. Now you have somebody who doesn't have anything to do with federal thinking in the EU, but the contrary. And he exchanged the flags. He interprets all from the flags. He leaves away the body and the ship and the federation issues. It's all about nation states. And he puts away Mercury, which is interesting because he thought it was the American eagle and he didn't want the American eagles in there. So, but this is also European integration, you might say, in a different way. Now you have a caricaturist or a painter actually doing something about the Treaty of Nice. The stars are falling out of the flag. The whole team is sort of rowdy. The sea is sort of difficult, the sky. And, well, Le Monde at the time said that the Nice conference didn't achieve much. It at best deepened and expanded the Rhine. Here you see how Angela Merkel is welcomed by Barroso on the EU Ship of State to save the EU Constitutional Treaty in 2005. Here you see EU, more recent, 2011, EU relations to China. The Chinese Ship of State, Wen Jiabao, at the World Economic Forum offers to take over European debt. And here you see another version of this Ship of State heads to catastrophe vis-à-vis state debts. And here you see something which you probably know. But this is also just another version of the Ship of State metaphor saying, why doesn't Lady Merkel finally become the captain and do the things she's supposed to do, instead of falling into a boat and rolling away? So I guess, I don't know where am I time-wise? 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. I give you a short one through the US, because it is a very short one. First I give you sort of, I mean, the Ship of State was there from the start because they took it from Greece and Rome, but also they took it from the British tradition. And usually, as you saw in the Dutch case, if you revolt against a tradition, you say you're better than the tradition, you incorporate it. So the Calvinists were sort of the better Catholics, and the Americans were the real Brits, and the real freedom was to be had there. But the US gives it a special revolutionary twist, and that is very different. Whereas in most other cases, the Ship of State is identified with the state apparatus. Here they identified the ship of state with the Constitution. And they mean it literally in the sense of the ship, the US Constitution that fought against Britain, but they also mean it not literally but metaphorically. This ship, the Constitution is our ship of state. And we are a constitutional state, and therefore this ship, it is sort of what the Germans would call Verfassungspatriotismus, but they never illustrated it with the ship. But the Americans had it from the start as a ship. Now here you have it first as a caricature of the movement of, this is the US Constitution up here, and basically it's about moving it from New York to Philadelphia to the place later called Washington, and how all sorts of building trades earn a lot of graft by moving the capital. But then something more serious is this. The ship is, the US Constitution is then paraded in inauguration parades of the President as a symbol of national unity and as a symbol relating to the Constitution. Here is the time of the secession. This is the Democratic Congress in caucus or convention in Chicago, and it tries to extend some hands to the South, make peace. Lincoln, the Republican, is at war. Here you see this is the South, and the ship of state of the South is going down, and those are all generals or admirals of the Northern Army. So you see it being used. The most famous use of the ship of state in the US is probably this one, The Building of the Ship, a poem by Longfellow, read to the masses in front of the Chamber of Commerce in Boston in 1849. 30,000 people listened. And it is about building a ship. The South and the North together form their common raw materials, getting together, building one ship, building one unit. It's called building of the ship, but it is the building of the ship of state.